So I was saying that our two speakers today are from the University of Antwerp. That's Dr. Bruno Horst. And Dr. Liliane Campos is from University Sorbonne Nouvelle in France. And they will be discussing interdisciplinarity from two quite different viewpoints. Bruno's talk is entitled Interdisciplinary Research, or IDR, to IDR or not to IDR. So this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available on the University of Essex website later on, like the two previous ones. This is the third one in a series of 4. We've got a fourth one planned for October. And so we've agreed, I think, that Bruno will start and Liliane will speak afterwards. So how about you take the floor, Bruno?
Thanks, Christine. I will share my presentation. One moment. Put it in preview mode. Okay. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us with this special interdisciplinary research webinar. I was asked to give a presentation about interdisciplinary research or not, question mark. So for me, it's opening the discussion on should we go for interdisciplinary research or not? As Christine mentioned, this is within the framework of UFE, and BioYUFE, as she explained, is a kind of subgroup that works on biodiversity, but is also looking into the interdisciplinary options of research. And as you can see, we are spread as universities from the north until the south of Europe and from the east until the west of Europe. So there is, based on what you see anyway, a lot of possibilities what biodiversity concerns and working together on that. So what is the link with interdisciplinary research, and also what is the link with BioYUFE or UFE in general? Well, what is important to know is that UFE is currently looking into research possibilities. They call it the Community Engaged Research and Innovation nodes. And what is it? Well, it is based on what is said, research, innovation, and also community engagement. So there are different aspects that are important within UFE. And BioYUFE, as a like of sub-node or a sub-initiative, has the potential to become such a node, a SERI node, as they call it. Why? Because we focus on biodiversity, but also we are looking into interdisciplinary options, for instance, within the framework of One Health. There are possibilities to engage community, but also stakeholders within this context. And that's when we call it not interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary. There's a strength, as I mentioned, from north to south and from east to west, which has a lot of research possibilities. UFE itself focuses on sustainability, digital society, and citizens' well-being. These are topics that are also very well related to biodiversity within an interdisciplinary context. As also is important, the urban aspect within UFE. And also we work on the education, research, innovation nexus. So there are a lot of possibilities there as well. Now, I think the most important question that we can ask ourselves is UFE and its impact and its unique selling proposition. And you can ask yourself, yeah, UFE itself, is it doing something different, something new, something more within a European education and research context? And what can it be? And we might ask ourselves, is UFE wanting to do something different than what each UFE university does separately? Can it be something different than all other alliances that are currently working in the EU? And so what could be the starting point, and where is the link with interdisciplinary work? Well, what we already observed during the past 3 years within BioYUFE is that it needs to come from the bottom, but also from the top. We need to try to find each other in that sense. We also need to try to find the right common challenges that fit within the UFE rationale. And these challenges need to be solved in some kind of inter or transdisciplinary way. We need to look at the barriers and try to remove these barriers, try to create opportunities and facilitate interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research. So that's where the opportunities lie. Now, before we go into the details, we need to ask ourselves, are we talking the same language? Because interdisciplinary research is often discussed, and often there's a mistake in the understanding of what it is. But here I give a simple overview of different disciplinary researches. And we start with intradisciplinary research. That's within one discipline, looking into topics within one discipline. We can talk about cross-disciplinarity. That means that we are viewing towards one discipline from different other disciplines. For instance, mathematics looking at biology. Then you have multidisciplinarity. That is a mix of several disciplines, but they're not really working together. They're looking at the same problem from their perspectives. And then we come to the interdisciplinary side, and that's where all the disciplines really mix up. They really integrate into something new, like a stew, for instance, that really creates another way of looking into the problem and looking into the sciences from the different disciplines melting into one same pot. And then you have the transdisciplinary, that's the most complicated phase. That's interdisciplinary work, but also looking from different perspectives, not only from scientific perspectives, but also from stakeholders and other people involved. And then it's a bit the cake. That's the most difficult one. Now, what are the barriers in universities regarding interdisciplinary research? Well, first of all, you have a lot of career path issues in finding people who think interdisciplinary, promoting them, evaluating them. It's not easy. There is also something that's called academic tribalism and misunderstanding. Usually, researchers from different disciplines, they talk different languages, they have different assumptions, different methods that they use, different commitments. So that's also a barrier. The power differences between different people who need to work together. A professor and a PhD student that have to work together, sometimes from different disciplines. That makes a power difference, which is also very difficult to somehow prevail. The lack of experience in how to collaborate in these interdisciplinary networks is an issue. Dealing with complex relationships, because it's usually more than only science. It's really human, it's really interacting. And so that makes it sometimes complicated to go forward. Personal qualities in understanding what interdisciplinary research means or transdisciplinary research means and how you do that. And also the collaborative attitudes that are related to this type of work is also difficult. And then last but not least, time. To overcome these barriers, you need to sniffle each other for quite a long time before you really can make a next step in collaborating together on specific challenges and topics. So in conclusion, you need the right ecosystem from a biology side that's very known. Now, what are the opportunities? Well, for universities, it's an opportunity to promote IDR, but also maybe for UFE and also for BioYUFE. You have an institutional vision, but that you can also do on the level of UFE. You have to recognize inter and transdisciplinary research. You have to try to provide education and training to bridge interdisciplinary structures and cultures. You have to enable knowledge sharing and inter and transdisciplinary networking. You need to provide some kind of career path to promote this kind of interdisciplinary research evaluation and facilitate it. So maybe the UFE Alliance is like the ideal network, let's say, to get this going, to start this, because you're not really interfering with the university policy, but you can ideally provide something new to promote these opportunities. Now, to come to the discussion of the importance of interdisciplinary research, this is a publication by the World Economic Forum in 2023, November 2023, where they asked themselves, yeah, interdisciplinary research is key to scientific discoveries. So why are universities so reluctant in crossing disciplines? And this is a slide that's published in this publication where they looked at how countries are doing on an interdisciplinary level. You see that China and India, for instance, are, let's say, very large. They have a lot of interdisciplinary work, and so you can see it in the size of the button. But they are also doing a lot of interdisciplinary research. 32% of their proportion of scientific research is on interdisciplinary work. Whereas, for instance, USA and also most of the European countries are, let's say, a little bit in the middle or have 10% less of interdisciplinary research. On the other hand, let's say the vertical side is the impact or the importance of this interdisciplinary research. And there you see, for instance, Hong Kong having a lot of impact and a lot of high quality interdisciplinary research. So that's actually mapping the current condition in the world of the past 5 years of interdisciplinary research. Now, why is this important to mention? Because the Times Higher Education is focusing more and more on impact of interdisciplinary research. They are currently looking into impact rankings. And they are actually now in 2024 going to introduce, let's say, a global interdisciplinary science ranking. That means that universities will not only be judged by their output, but also by their interdisciplinarity and also by how universities help support, let's say, guide interdisciplinary research. So it's also on how this will be done. What do they say, or what do they say in this article on challenges? Well, there needs to be more dedicated policy processes to enhance this type of research, including physical facilities, networking facilities, administrative support and training, and staff incentives to promote this. They need to provide more funding for interdisciplinary research as a percentage of all overall research funding. And there needs to be greater visibility on interdisciplinary research outputs, mostly regarding global South-North collaborations to raise impact and reputation. So also here you can ask yourself, is the UFE Alliance not the ideal network to provide support for this? Another publication is a publication by the European Research Council. There they saw that supporting interdisciplinary research really has a large impact. So it's a publication of 2019. And what they saw was on the scale of significance, you can see that major scientific breakthroughs and also major scientific advances are done within those ERC projects that have a high grade of interdisciplinary work. So that means the importance, that's where the highest risks are taken, of course, but you can see that they looked at the evaluations of these projects and really saw a large impact on that, not only on different areas and domains as well. I refer to a publication from the ERC Frontier Research on biodiversity. These are all ERC grants on biodiversity. So, and they also looked at how this relates to strategy. So there are almost 240 projects on biodiversity in ERC. And they looked at the countries, they looked at the number of projects in each framework, and there you see 88 in social sciences, 105 in life sciences, and 43 in physical science and engineering. But what you can see is when you look at the word cloud of these ERC grants, that there is a lot of, let's say, biodiversity and global is, let's say, the central core, but you see a lot of other domains popping up in this type of fundings. This is let's say, a signal that is really fits with the strategy, but also with interdisciplinarity in common. As you can see, these ERC projects on biodiversity are for 81% linked to the strategy of 2030. So that means that they are really focused on the future. And when we look at, let's say, the participation of these biodiversity topics, we see 4 different pillars of the 2030 strategy. And you can see the number of ERC projects that are under there. Restore ecosystems is the biggest one with almost 140 projects. And when we look at pillar 2, you can see that restoring ecosystems has, let's say, ecology as the main term, but you can also see There are links with social sciences, with genetics, with economics, with marine biology, with geology, etc. So there's a lot of links with other domains, and that really indicates the importance of this. Just to give you one example of such a project, we have the niche for nature-based solutions. That's an ERC project. And just to mention what the link is with BioYUFE, when we look at let's say the summary of this project, you really see they are focusing on promising solutions to design greener, more sustainable and resilient cities. They are inspired, or the starting point is inspired and supported by nature. They can bring together environmental and social benefits with a healthier and happier residents. The goal is to develop and test new interdisciplinary approaches to foster the deployment of nature-based solutions and understand trade-offs and synergies between social and economic outcomes, ecologic outcomes. And finally, it is a project to help urban planners optimize co-benefits and find a balance between biodiversity conservation, economic development, and social well-being. And this really fits with the rationale of UFE. You really clearly see that this is a link. Now, the last question that I want to pose, and it's an open question to all of you, is interdisciplinary research a point of emphasis within the SERI rationale of UFE? And BioYUFE. Are universities in UFE, do they have experience in interdisciplinary research? I know, for instance, Bremen clearly has some of these very good interdisciplinary initiatives, but we didn't map all of it. Who in UFE has the power or the experience in guiding interdisciplinary research and support instruments? We, for instance, the last year, we developed a summer school or a masterclass for interdisciplinary research, really focusing on the process of how to set up interdisciplinary projects, and also guiding and tools, creating guiding and tools for that. There's a lot of emphasis on importance on that in other alliances and in other universities as well. BioYUFE might be a starting point as one of the pilots, let's say, initiatives. It clearly and thematically fits with all these aspects and all these criteria. And maybe there will be other SERI nodes with also interdisciplinarity as one of the common nominators. So that is a question mark that still needs to be answered by the time. Finally, these are the BioYUFE. This is the BioYUFE team and context. This is the team that started off 3 years ago. And you see on the left the PIs that are involved in this, the core team. And I'm then one of the people who supports this. And if there is more information needed on the masterclass for interdisciplinary research, you can contact me. That's it.
Thank you so much, Bruno, for providing so much information from your viewpoint as a research support person, admin person, and for putting UFE and BioYUFE at the center of your presentation and working around this. That was very rich. Thank you. Perhaps we should go straight to Liliane's presentation before we start the discussion. So Dr. Liliane Campos is from University Sorbonne Nouvelle, as I said earlier, but just in case some of you joined us in the meantime. And her presentation is entitled Biocriticism as Interdisciplinary Practice. So Liliane, over to you.
Thank you, Christine. I think we're still seeing Bruno's screen. So I think Bruno needs to stop sharing his screen. So, great, thank you, Bruno. And I'll share mine. Okay, so yes, thank you very much for, and thanks for the invitation to all of you. So in this talk, I'm going to present an example of interdisciplinary work. And I should say that you might debate the inter, it might be cross or multi, and there could be variations here on the appropriate prefix after what Bruno just explained. But what I'd like to do is, starting from this wonderful cover image of one of the nature issues. So I love this image. You can see all kinds of exciting sciences moving forwards towards the future here, but you can note that the humanities are not really very present. In fact, apart from the invisible hand of economics, there's not much here to represent the humanities. So as a literary scholar, I'm going to suggest that interdisciplinary work can be useful not just within the hard sciences, as nature seems to suggest, but within a broader spectrum of research. So I'm going to present this project, which is called Biocriticism. It's funded by the Institut Universitaire de France, and I started it in 2019. And what we do is that I bring together academics and artists to examine cultural representations of biology. So the project examines how cultural representations of biology are shifting in our current context and what role these representations might play in this century's biopolitics. So I defined the remit of the project as three different branches, which are on this slide. First of all, examining contemporary artistic engagements with biological images, discourses, and practices. Secondly, examining critical theory that engages with the concepts and discourses of the life sciences. And thirdly, examining art as a space which engages critically with biological theory, technology, and rhetoric. Now, I should explain from the start that what I mean by critical relations and criticism is not that we criticize biology or that we judge biology in some way. The action of criticism here is understood as the analysis of the discursive and semiotic structures of representations of biology. What do these discursive structures, what do these discourses and signs say about how we understand biology today and how we place it in society? So the project brings together academics, but also artists and science communicators who in some cases are academics, but in some cases are journalists or from other contexts. So the webinar invites these different participants, scholars, artists, and art lovers in general to discuss artworks and texts that engage with these representations of biology. This is an example of publications that came out of the project. This is an open access collective volume that you can find online if you'd like to read more about the biological imagination in contemporary literature and performance, and a couple of examples of recent events. So these are this year's events. I co-organized a conference on microscopic imaginaries in literature and another one on microscopic life in performance. And I'd like to mention also another interdisciplinary project that I've done part of this work in collaboration with, and that's the RevMcNat project. So this is an interdisciplinary network that's led by Dr. Eric Bertest at the CNRS in France. And the goal of the RevMcNat project is to explore the microbiome revolution. So how does the concept of microbiomes transform different disciplines? And the idea is to look beyond biological sciences to all different disciplines and ask what is changing because of this concept of the microbiome. Okay, so this is what I'm going to present today. I'll start by presenting a few interdisciplinary conversations that have been very important in the biocriticism project, in particular with science communicators, communication scholars and artists. And then in a second kind of part of this presentation, I'll focus on a particularly interdisciplinary question, which is how is microbiology transforming our conception of the human subject? But let's start with the overview of the kinds of conversations that this project has enabled. And first of all, it's produced a lot of conversations between literary scholars such as myself and science communicators who are often biologists. Now, there are two aspects to these conversations. on the one hand, for us literary scholars, we then approach science communication, or popular science, as we generally call it, as an object of literary study. So we analyze it as a text that has poetics, that has metaphors, that has all kinds of strategies that we might usually associate with literature. To give an example of this work, I've done some research on the idea of microbiome poetics, so working on a selection of mostly recent popular science works and also exhibition catalogues, where I looked at the language that's used to describe microbes and microbiomes. And I observed these interesting poetics and transformations in these poetics. For instance, the fact that we personify microbes, that we describe them as tiny people, but that in contemporary popular science, the way we personify is changing and is shifting from military images, the microbe as the enemy and the army that we're fighting, to social images. So microbes as communities, teachers, doctors, team players, and work colleagues. And these are all expressions that you find in the books that are on this slide. And another interesting movement that I observed in these poetics is that more and more ecological imagery is being brought into the description of the microbial world. So that the human body, for instance, as an ecosystem, as a natural park, as a zoo, as a forest. So here again, you have a kind of imaginary that's developing, but that's shifting the way we think of the microbial universe. So what does this show? It shows a kind of shift in the way we imagine the biological. What do scientists get from these conversations? Well, the other aspect, the kind of reverse side of these conversations, is that what the scientists that we've invited tend to get is a reflection on narrative form as a means of science communication. So how does a particular storytelling form, a particular way of telling stories, how can it communicate a scientific idea, and how can it do it most efficiently? Now, this can be problematic for literary scholars. Some literary scholars are very annoyed by the idea that you think of stories as ways of communicating, because that's really way too reductive. But I don't have that kind of reticence. So in fact, I think that the epistemic approach to narrative form is really important if you want to understand how culture is shaping our view of biology today. So as an example of this work, here I brought up an article that I co-wrote with a microbiologist, Eric Baptiste. And what we do in this article is that, so I should perhaps translate the title because it's in French. So the title means telling stories about viruses, an interdisciplinary dialogue about the narrative transposition of virological discourse. It's not the lightest title ever. So what we do in this article is that we ask what kind of stories can efficiently convey the profoundly alien and different nature of viral life, and particularly the problem of scale, the fact that viral life occurs at such non-human scales, not just physical scales, but temporal scales, because of the incredible speed of viral evolution compared to human evolution. So what happens in this article is that narratology, that's me, gives biology some formal answers to challenge in communication. So what kind of narrative form can really help us to get these ideas across? And conversely, what biology gives me, as a narratologist, is what this article brought me is an awareness of how much the typical storytelling forms that we use mostly in literature, so the kind of realist novel or realist fiction form, how much this limits our perception of the world, and how, particularly through the kind of scalar framing, the scale frames that fiction imposes on our way of viewing the world. So the second type of conversation that I wanted to mention in this project is the conversations it's enabled between literary scholars and communication scholars. So those who study communication. Now, there's several fields that are particularly pertinent within communication studies, and I put them on this slide. So 3 fields or subfields. The first is the rhetoric of science, and here I've kind of summarized what that field is about through this quotation, the idea that rhetoric is epistemic, that you find epistemic value in rhetorical forms. And a subfield within this rhetoric of science field is the rhetoric of health and medicine. It's a very healthy, very dynamic subfield. So this subfield focuses on the persuasive agents and functions of health and medicine discourse, who is persuading whom of what, and what are the means of persuasion. And a recurrent question in this field is, what is the rhetorical life of a scientific fact as it crosses over into different discursive domains? So as it moves away from the specialized discourse of biology itself into other discursive domains, which can be popular science, which can be general media, which can be political, which can all kinds of discursive domains. And a third relevant subfield here to my project is what we call culture-centered approaches to health communication. So here I just mentioned one example, which is Sastry and Dutter's work, because what Sastry and Dutter do in the article that I put on the slide is that they look at pandemic communication, so kind of political and general media coverage of a certain pandemic, so that the AIDS pandemic, through post-colonial structures. So in that article in particular, they look at how the American media describes American intervention in Indian health policy as a kind of savior, America saving the third world from the pandemic of AIDS. So the subfield brings us kind of political analysis to a certain type of discourse, which is based on biology, but which is being driven by the media. Okay, so what do these conversations bring? Well, what the communication scholars bring to me is that they highlight the underlying power structures and the politics of science communication or cultural representations of science. They also bring an awareness of the rhetorical traction, if you like, the efficiency, rhetorical efficiency of certain narrative strategies. So for instance, this comment that I made earlier about microbiome poetics, where I said that there's a kind of ecologization going on of the microbial imaginary, that we imagine the microbial through these ecological metaphors. Well, this study by Hodgetts and company finds a very similar idea, but what they're looking at is how to best communicate about microbes to the general public. So they look at how different metaphors used about microbes have more or less efficient effects on convincing people to clean their kitchens in a certain way or relate to the microbiome in a certain way. And this is what they say: metaphors taken from macroecology have some traction, so that they're efficient, such as describing microbial ecologies as deserts, rainforests, or fields. Metaphors like cleaning, comparing cleaning to gardening, and keeping pathogenic bacterial weeds at bay by cultivating bacterial lawns. So what I'm getting at here is that biocriticism is can be a joint tool where literature scholars and communication scholars work together. And this is the idea that I defend in a forthcoming chapter, which I've put on this slide. This was co-written with two communication scholars, Lisa Karenin and Jennifer Malkowski. And here in this chapter, we defend the idea that biocriticism can be a mode of attention to the semiotic fabric of the age of biology, so to the signs, like what symbols and signs are developed about biology and our culture, and what are they telling us about how we view biology and the politics of this view. Now, a third kind of conversation, which is absolutely vital to this project, so I want to explain it a little bit too, is conversations between academics and artists. I put literary scholars here again, but all the academics in this project, not just the literature academics, were involved in these conversations. So what do artists bring? Well, I think art itself is an incredibly important space, not just of representation, but of critical representation, right? It has a kind of reflexive role in that art is thinking about how we represent biology and what that does, what a certain type of representation does. I'm going to give an example of this kind of artistic biocriticism. This is a project developed by French designer Marie-Sarah Adenis, And the project is called Le virus que donc je suis, the virus which therefore I am. And in this project, Adenis set out to resist the representation of viruses as enemies. What she wanted to do was to highlight instead the crucial role that viruses play in evolution and in our ecosystems. In 2020, in the midst of a pandemic, Adenis created a series of virus masks. So this is an example of a virus mask on the screen. These virus masks are homage that she pays to the role of viruses as what she calls sculptors of the living world, and as messengers between species, since viruses can carry fragments of DNA from one species to another. And you have all kinds of interesting examples of the importance of viruses in our evolution, such as the evolution of the human placenta. It's a very useful organ. So to draw attention to the vital role played by viruses in ecosystems, Adenis imagines the masks as lines that are composed as kind of fragmented lines made of dots. And she views these as fragments of DNA and RNA, but also as reminiscent of maps and of the trajectories on oceanographic maps of the kind of ship trajectories that you'd have through these dotted lines. And the masks are designed to be worn by human beings, but unlike medical masks, they connect us to the viruses instead of separating us from them. Adenis describes them as optical instruments. So this artwork is biocritical because it's questioning the military terminology of pandemic rhetoric and instead emphasizing a different view of the virus as a messenger and a vector of communication. Adenis's work has been exhibited in various places, but I want to draw attention to this performance which used them. So this is a show called Viral. It was co-written by a historian of science, Frédéric Aitouati, and the philosopher of science, Bruno Latour. Here, the performer is wearing a mask, one of Adenis's masks, and dancing with several. There are several of them on stage. So the performer is emphasizing the relation between the human and the virus. So together, Adenis's mask, Latour's text, and Aitouati's dramaturgy constitute a biocritical representation and an intervention in the rhetoric that surrounded the COVID-19 pandemic. They foreground the fact that viruses are, in fact, that we never see viruses directly. We only ever have access to the virus as a signifier that's constructed by a scientific context, but also by a cultural and a political context. So what happens here is that the artistic work materializes a kind of epistemic question or an epistemic disturbance. So yes, I wrote that again on the side. This idea that artistic work might materialize an epistemic disturbance, this is very much criticism in the sense defined by Judith Butler, because Judith Butler defines criticism as a reaction to crisis. So she says, when do we need to think critically? Well, when there's some kind of crisis in our way of knowing, when our way of knowing has to evolve, and to help us to evolve new ways of thinking, or to face what she calls a tear in the fabric of our epistemological web, the act of criticism is simply a stepping back from an epistemic construction enough to question it and to think about it in different ways. Okay, so I'm going to end just with an example of, or a rather more focused example of an interdisciplinary question that came out of the biocriticism project. This is a question that I've been working on for 2 or 3 years now, which is how is microbiology transforming our conception of the human subject? So I see this question as, I situate it at the intersection of 3 fields, studies in the philosophy of biology, popular microbiology and the kind of narrative strategies that I find there, and literature, which is my original field, particularly fiction and poetry. So to start with the philosophy of biology, well, microbiological subject becomes a kind of philosophical question because the idea of the individual is questioned and redefined so much by contemporary microbiology. In a kind of general context, definitions of the biological individual are questioned or at least reworked by the notion of symbiosis and all kinds of studies of symbiotic relations. The division or binary opposition between a self and a non-self is questioned by changing definitions in immunology of the immunological individual. What is the individual if it includes, for instance, its microbiome? And in evolutionary theory, the individual is, in some cases, increasingly replaced by collectives. So here the emphasis is on cooperation as the factor for natural selection instead of competition. Networks and processes. So some biologists present interaction patterns as the best unit or an alternative unit of natural selection, as Doolittle and Booth summarize it in the title of one of their articles. It's the song that counts, not the singers. So my hypothesis is that this questioning of this kind of general questioning of the individual forces us to redefine the human subject, and that this rethinking of the human subject is occurring across a range of storytelling sites. And so this is what I understand as storytelling sites. There's some literature that's kind of on the right-hand side of the screen here. There's some novels and there's some graphic novels, some poetry. And then there's the popular science, which is also a storytelling site on the left-hand side. And I've got an exhibition catalogue in there, the exhibition Gloire aux microbes. So these are all different narrative sites that are changing the story about the human subject. So reading across these different storytelling sites requires me to think of narrative through the history of literature and the history of science. So to bring in this kind of the extra historical perspective. And I want to just give one example of why the history of science has to be kind of added into the disciplinary mix at this stage. Well, reading across these different stories requires me to follow the rhetorical life of certain terminologies and certain images. And here, just to take one example, I want to talk a bit about this image of the body as an environment, which might seem obvious to us now, but really isn't. So let's just think for a minute about this image, the fact that the body is an environment. This is how a contemporary poet expresses it with a little bit of humor. My body, Dickinson writes, is a spaceship designed to optimize the proliferation and growth of its microbial cosmonauts. Great. This might remind you of a very influential work of popular biology from the 1980s, where Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan wrote that beneath our superficial differences, we are all of us walking communities of bacteria, with respiring mitochondria and spirochetal secret agents dividing their cells. Communities of the microcosm have alighted, if briefly, on the moon. Okay, so we have the same image, right? That the human body is a community and also as a kind of vessel for its microbial miniature inhabitants. But this idea of the body as controlled by miniature agents might well remind you of an earlier but even more influential work, which is, of course, Dawkins's The Selfish Gene. This is what Dawkins writes in 1976 about his vision of the gene. They have come a long way, these replicators. Now they go by the name of genes, and we are their survival machines. Okay, so to understand our contemporary representation of the microbial, we have to understand the 20th century's representations of the gene and this kind of this imaginary of the secret agent within us that's writing our story without us being quite aware of it. This is kind of building the foundation for the 21st century's imaginary of the microbial. And this image itself would not be possible were it not for a 19th century image, which is the very idea of the internal environment. And until Claude Bernard proposed this idea in well, it's posthumous text, but in the 1870s, Claude Bernard was in fact the first to suggest that there are two environments that are important for any organism: the external environment that it evolves in, and an internal environment. He invents this idea in which its organs and tissues are placed. Okay, so this is just to give an idea of the kind of historical detective work that you want to do if you're working on scientific imaginaries, and you have to work across both art and science. So to conclude, it's obvious that for my work, interdisciplinarity, or perhaps multidisciplinarity or cross-disciplinarity, depending on how we apply Bruno's categories, it's evidently a necessity. But there are a number of frictions that arise in these collaborations. And just to mention two, there's the format of scientific research. And now co-writing an article with a microbiologist was a very, very interesting experience for me, because it showed me just how different our conceptions are of what constitutes a good scholarly article. I think an article should find some questions, and the microbiologist thought it should give some answers. And this was a surprisingly difficult difference to overcome, although we did, in a way, find a good way of negotiating it. Working with communication scholars has also been interesting and challenging in a different way, because it's shown to me how much of the humanities sees storytelling as a reflection of society. So then when you look at stories, you want to find the most typical formulaic stories that reflect something in society. Whereas as a literature person, I'm looking for the original, the atypical, the one that's different from all the others, and that's why it's interesting. So again, we have a different approach to what's interesting in stories. Is it interesting because they're recurrent, because we're all taking the same stories, or because they're unique? Okay, but just to conclude, so I think that the potential of these collaborations is that they break down some of the rigid conceptions that we have of our fields, or of how certain terms apply to our fields. So to me, these collaborations suggest that art is a site of knowledge, that science is also storytelling, that scientific imaginaries might be as important as scientific facts in the way society relates to science, and that any discourse, whether it's artistic or scientific, is a rhetorical intervention that takes place in a political context. I've put a bit of bibliography here just to give a few of the references I mentioned, but I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liliane. This is fascinating. Wonderful. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and please feel free to write your questions in the chat. It's easier for us to proceed this way, to address them. But perhaps just before we start looking at the questions from the participants, I would like to ask Liliane, you've talked about how your work has, and interdisciplinarity in your work has the kind of results that it's yielded. I'm also curious to know how much science you feel you had to read or become familiar with as part of your project. In other words, to what extent did you have to go for this disciplinary shift from your field in the humanities to the sciences, over to the sciences, to conduct this project? And also I have a question for Bruno. I was curious to know whether you could tell us the story of a successful interdisciplinary project that you've been part of or accompanied. So I don't know who wants to speak first.
Yeah, well, I'll give a quick answer just to start. But yes, so for me, working on the cultural representations of biology, popular science is the main interface between science, the specialized scientific publications, and general broader culture. So the most important thing for me is to be up to date on the popular science, and how, and then to discuss as much as possible with scientists, so actual biologists. But it's true, I do read some specialized publications, but I don't feel I have to be up to date on all the specialized publications that come out on the microbiome, thank goodness, because I humanly couldn't. So I read some specialized work, but mostly popular science, which is the kind of the material that's feeding into culture. So for me, it's the most important influence. And then it's great to have a scientist's perspective on popular science and everything that is wrong or it's filtered in popular science.
Very interesting. It shows once again the importance of this mediation of passing on the scientific knowledge to non-scientific readers. Sorry, Bruno, what about you?
Yes, well, one example that I can think of in this interdisciplinary context is an example that is currently happening as we speak. We at the University of Antwerp are working together from the health department, are working together with artists in the Middelheim Museum. That's a park very nearby to the university campus, and together with a hospital. Where we are looking at design sciences. So we have design sciences, health, and arts. And we are looking into creating environments where children who are long-term sick can be given a stimulating environment to improve their health stay during hospital stay together with families. And so this is really a collaboration of designers who are designing the gardens together with biologists. They're looking into how to frame the whole thing, and then taking together the health scientists on how they can participate and create a new environment for these children to have an optimal stay during their hospital. I think it's a nice interdisciplinary approach with a clear goal to help environments optimal in the eco environments optimally for human beings. So that's a nice example, I think.
Yeah, turn towards well-being in sickness. Yeah.
Yes, and also integrating the artists, the Middelheim Museum, who are looking from an artistic perspective how art can improve health. So you have biologists, artists, designers, and health scientists. So it's really a nice example of what we are doing.
Yeah, and again, it ties in with the our role, the role that we're encouraged to play as this interaction between science and society. Science in the broadest sense, that includes us as a humanities university. We're also expected to work on that, but that's a wonderful example. So as I said, we had a couple of questions from Virginie Bull. Hello, Virginie, how lovely to see you here. Virginie is a great translator, so that's another form of writing. And would you like to open your mic and ask your questions yourself directly to our speakers?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so my first question was to Bruno Ost, and it was, could you please elaborate a little on your comments about bottom-up and top-down dynamics in interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research? Well, what you just said partly answered my question, but how do these dynamics engage in the different communities that can be involved in such research? That's what I'd be interested in knowing a little more about, please.
Okay, thanks for the question, Virginie. An example of a top-down, let's say, interdisciplinary challenge, when you look at the calls of the EU projects in general, just the EU portal, there are very clear, let's say, calls that focus on interdisciplinary work. Nowadays, about 60% of all European project calls ask for some kind of interdisciplinary approach. So that's the top-down example. It's very clear if you know where to search and how to search for these calls, that you find those interdisciplinary calls and apply for them in an interdisciplinary way, of course. The bottom-up are of course ideas from researchers themselves, like the example that I gave. It starts from a challenge from a social health perspective, but needs to be solved from different disciplines and different approaches. So that's not based on a top-down call, but it's based on a bottom-up problem in society and asks some kind of solution. And there, of course, the downside, let's say, is finding money to get that realized, because you will probably need hospitals, maybe you need a city to co-invest, you need the stakeholders to co-invest in realizing this. Whereas, of course, European Union, they provide money for your project. So that's really the bottom up and top down. Related to UFE, that will still remain to be seen. UFE is still young in a way. If there ever is going to be money, maybe there will be top-down initiatives, like the UFE for Postdocs call that was recently. It's a bit top-down, but in a way, of course, you also have the bottom-up, because researchers need to align with the call. They need to be, it needs to be something in their field, and they need to find the right partnerships. So it's always bottom-up and top-down, and that's what works best. If you can provide incentives from top-down and bottom-up, you will always have some kind of result. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And Virginie had a question for Liliane as well.
Yes. So my question for Liliane was about metaphors. What are your views on the usefulness and scientific accuracy of metaphors in scientific discourse, especially in relation to biology? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. There's some wonderful 17th century texts. If you look at the British Royal Society, for instance, in their foundational text, they declare that they're not going to use any metaphors because this is bad. And we want direct language that says things directly and without any hesitation or doubt. And of course, science, at least Western science, did not manage to do that at all. There's a lot of work on the inherence and unavoidability of metaphor within scientific terminology, which does not mean that scientific terminology is imprecise or vague, but in all kinds of fields, whether it's quantum mechanics and words such as uncertainty, and which have then a very problematic cultural reception, even if they're used in a very precise sense. So quantum mechanics has this issue. Biology, starting, or at least particularly clearly with Darwin and the terms that Darwin used and that have continued to be central to evolutionary theory, but that are such as natural selection, for instance. So metaphor is unavoidable. Metaphor does not mean that it's imprecise. It's not a fault. It's not a weakness, but it is a grip that culture then has on scientific discourse, and where culture then can go in all kinds of directions that are more or less creative and more or less imaginative.
Thank you. And what do you think that there's a bias that may come with metaphors, or not particularly?
I think any metaphor is a choice, right? So you're choosing an existing shape to say something new. You have to use a word that's already there to say something that you're thinking that's new. So there's always an issue, a kind of direction taken by metaphor, whereas you could have taken a different direction. So it will always orient at least the cultural reception of science, not science itself. I'm not saying that it kind of introduces bias in scientific theory, but the way culture perceives the science.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can add, Liliane, concerning the interdisciplinary research process. Metaphors are really quite important in the final step, because it helps to integrate disciplines. You can use a metaphor to visualize the integration of the different disciplines into something new. And it's easier to talk about it because it's a metaphor. It's not science, it's not mathematics, it's not biology, it's not social sciences or whatever. It's something new, and it creates common ground and integration. So that I wanted to add, because you don't underestimate the importance of metaphors in that step.
Thank you. There was a question from Bart van der Put, which Lilian answered in the chat. And there's also a question from Ute Meyer from the University of Bremen, another of the BioYUFE universities. So perhaps Ute, you might want to ask your question.
I do.
Yes.
I like to ask my question. I must say I am really obviously a pure scientist. I get a little bit lost in this discussion. However, I was reminded to a picture of the grand German philosopher Wittgenstein, who you might know this, and I just put it into the chat. I mean, I think you can look at it. And he was also criticism using language and making categories with languages, as far as I understand. And this picture, which you might be able to open, what is it? What you can see? What is it? Is it a hare or is it a duck? It's both. But you can only see once in a time. You either see the hare or duck. You cannot see the whole picture. So he says, just describe what you see, don't interpret or don't talk whatsoever. And I think I must say, yes, I'm a scientist, but I worked for non-governmental NGOs for a long time. They used to work interdisciplinary, of course, because of follow issue with different, let's say, teams of different people doing different things. Some are, well, of course, doing research in publications, others do the communication, and they have to talk to each other to make sure that the communication is exactly to the point where we go to. If you want to do interdisciplinary work, I think you have to have a common goal. Otherwise, it's very difficult. You must know, or let's say, to have a common question, what's on this picture? And then you have two different pairs of eyes and you can discuss what you see. And it comes out that both people are right. It's a hare and it's a duck. So the question in general, what I think it's really, really important to work interdisciplinary, because otherwise you don't see the whole truth. But also to the point of Lilian, I think that science does not communicate at all so much. So it's a major problem of science not to communicate and leave the room open for interpretation, because these popular books, The Gut and things like that, these are popular books of people have studies, but they're not scientists. They interpret science, and I mean also for a goal, for instance, and let's say in Corona times, it was a goal to prevent people from or to give people the knowledge on how to behave, because the virus was really dangerous. Although, of course, there's other viruses or other microbes we really need, but not all microbes are good microbes and not all microbes are bad microbes. It's a very complex thing. And the question is how to communicate complexity at all. And the simplest, to make it simple, is always making things untrue. It's only one aspect. You don't even see a duck if you look at a picture, and to take it too simple. So I mean, I think this is a major problem, that communication as such will make things easier. I mean, it has to easify. It's done for some purpose, and it's also difficult just to say, well, it's a contrary. Microbes are a universe, they're wonderful, but no, they're not only wonderful, they're really difficult. So I have a garden and there's full of slugs and snails at the moment, and I know that they're important for the environment, but I do fight them because I want the vegetables. So, I mean, there are many truths. So this is a question on your work. I mean, also the critical, let's say, critical view on how it is science is, the perception of science is at the moment. There's also ask a question on what is your own, let's say, objective then, what would you say, what would you like to tell people? Sorry for these many questions.
So I think this question mostly for me. Well, anyway, I'll start with a reaction. I think you're never going to avoid the kind of the fact that science passes into culture in an unfaithful way, in a transformative, imaginative way that no longer corresponds to what the actual research was. And I think my general aim is to engage with cultural representations of science, because I think it's vital to do this if we want to understand why, for instance, a suspicion of science arises, why reluctance towards the experts discourse arises in the political fields today. So that there's kind of there's a social position of scientific discourse that is problematic, and that I think we can only engage through with the help of culture and how culture is represented in science. So there's kind of two levels. There's what is culture saying about the scientific ideas, and how is it imagining microbes, and how is it kind of what different strands are coming into this, but also what is it imagining about scientists and what scientific facts are, and so I think both are vital. I think we can't imagine biodiversity if we don't include the microscopic in biodiversity, and it's incredibly underrepresented in cultural representations of biodiversity. Insects, microbes, algae, all kinds of microscopic microorganisms or small organisms are underrepresented in the cultural narratives that are told about biodiversity. So that's one example of a narrative that needs to shift, right? Or it needs to be worked on. But to work on it, we have to engage with what's out there, what's culture saying, and then there's how is culture representing scientific work and scientific hypotheses. So yeah, but I take your point that the scientists themselves might need to engage more in the communication. That's a problem of squaring the circle, right? How do we have time? I imagine this is the problem for the scientists. How on earth
you do obviously do communication, because art is a form of communication, of course. I mean, but for the pure natural scientists, they don't communicate enough, maybe. And still, Bruno, maybe about the question of how do you think interdisciplinarity can be, I mean, what is it then the disciplinarity needs a certain objective? Do you agree with that point?
Yeah, it's of course the most important starting point to solve something, and it can be a research question or it can be a problem, social or economic, whatever. But there needs to be some kind of common ground where people can see, okay, I can contribute to that problem or that challenge. And I prefer to say challenge because it's not always a problem. Usually it is, but not always. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, some scientists are really good communicators. I just heard one last week who talked about soils, and he was pretty amazing, doing 4 lectures in one day and all over the place. It's really his self-attributed mission is to pass on. He's trained as a scientist at the Museum d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, but he spends a lot of time just passing on his knowledge, I suppose, in a language that's accessible, but that also is very, it sounded to me very technical at the same time. So it is possible. There was a question from Bart that we could go back to, perhaps to voice it and share it with, I mean, everyone's access to the chat, but perhaps Bart, what you might want to exchange with Liliane about the point that you raised.
Well, first of all, hello everybody. I am Bart, and I have an artistic research practice that involves plants and also microbes. I am with my artistic practice as a postdoc plugged in with my project into a bioethics and philosophy department, University of Antwerp. So the first question that I had for Liliane was, of course, if she has access or has had access to the lab to have a more embodied experience with microorganisms. That's one, and this relates, of course, to the positioning of artistic agency in scientific departments or other departments, and what kind of freedom you have to ask the questions and to even disturb in a creative way the ongoing protocols for truly transdisciplinary research.
Yes, so thanks, Bart, for that question. And I hope you're aware of this workshop on microbe stories that's coming up in July in your department.
Well, I'm co-organizing.
Oh, sorry. So of course you know. So yes, I was saying to you that the lab I went into to think about this question of narrative strategies for viral discourse was actually a lab that worked on models of evolution. Simulation, modelizing and simulating on computers viral evolution. So I was in the lab, but unfortunately there were no viruses, at least that we were consciously working on there. I'm sure we were exchanging plenty. But yes, I've not had that experience of the artist trying to get into a lab, as I'm not an artist myself. Most of the bio artists that I've discussed with and worked with in this project were microbiologists or biologists to start with. So it's true that I've mostly had that interaction with biologists who develop an artistic practice. I don't know if that's your case. Perhaps it's a different viewpoint if you're an artist trying to come into a scientific context.
Well, I have been trained in Aalto University in the biophilia lab for biological arts. So for 6 years, I've been introduced in all kinds of protocols related to plants and microbes. Yeah.
Great. But so I do find that most of the creative energy tends to come from people who have training in the natural sciences and then develop this kind of what we can call bioartistic practice. They've not usually told me about kind of resistance because they managed to develop this in parallel to their research. But what you're describing sounds like perhaps a bit more conflict, or maybe you're just imagining that it can be difficult for the artist.
Yes, but in any case, if you want to ask critical questions and question in a critical way emergent technologies, then they have to be open for you possibly changing the way how they relate with their so-called objects of study, the microbial world. And that is, of course, not always a given. And also the time that they allocate to PhD students or master students to collaborate is always a question of negotiation and power. And in my case, I'm lucky. I have budgets both from the arts and from a research foundation in Belgium. So I'm quite independent, but still many other people, as we try to broaden up the space for more of these kind of transdisciplinary projects involving the creation of artistic knowledge, it's not a given. It's one of the obstacles that we have to take into account.
Yeah, absolutely, given how precious everyone's time is. But this is also something that Bruno was flagging. I don't know how much space there is for instance, artistic collaborators in the structures that you create.
Everything is possible. Everything is possible. It's only a matter of finding the right people to be open for that. And I think that's where Bart has a problem when he meets a scientist of another domain and they're not open to discuss. Then it stops. You need to be open for it. And that's where it all starts. That's where the magic starts. Yeah.
Thank you. Great exchanges. There are no more questions in the chat. Perhaps people have some final questions, participants who are there. Perhaps not.
Maybe just to add to the comment that I gave, I think it's also the task of giving guidance to the importance of interdisciplinary research and to give a lot of, let's say, examples, but also the added value of being more creative, of coming up with new approaches for scientists that they did not know before, because they're always into their research and their themes and their way of thinking. And it's opening up the way of thinking. I think that is the first step when you can open that up and they're open for other ideas, for other approaches, then it can start. So that's quite important. So you have to put a lot of effort also in opening up their minds. Yeah, just wanted to add, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Christina, go ahead.
I would like to add something because I'm also a postdoc, I'm also an artist, and I work instead of with the ethicists, I work in the biotechnology department. And I am lucky because I have, from my first education, I have a PhD in chemistry, so I know the lab quite well. And the people we're working with, they are extremely open. I mean, they open the position for this kind of collaboration, let's say, between art, science, and philosophy. But at the same time, I observe how squeezed they are in terms of time and of what they have to perform every day. And they have just no space to do real transdisciplinary collaborations the way that I see this. So I think when discussing this, we have to maybe reconsider the position and the role of a scientist. Because I think they are often seen, especially in the science-art collaborations, is always asked, okay, what does this artist do and how does the artist get involved? But the question, I think, is much more, how does the scientist really get involved? Because they have such a clear agenda and schedule, and it's so full that they don't even have time to think about their own work, let alone about the work together with an artist who comes from another planet. And this is not to excuse them or to, it's more to, yeah, I think not everybody has the possibility to be inside of such a situation. So I'm more reflecting on what I have been able to see.
Can I give a comment to that? I think you're right. Indeed, it's time is an issue. And that's maybe something that we can solve. If you would let 2 or 3 people talk to each other, they might take a year before they have, let's say, a common ground. If you guide them in what the steps are, how they can approach it, they lose less time and they quicker go to yes or no. This is something that we can do together. And it's that process that can be guided and that can, let's say, ignite, but also speed up the whole integration step. And that's where we, I think, can help. It's helping in guiding, finding each other. Whereas you can leave it up to them and then they struggle and they keep on discussing without somebody guiding them, facilitating the whole process. So I think there is a lot of time to be gained. Yeah, but you need a facilitator. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? No? Well, if not, we can leave it to that. Thank you so much for your presentations and for the questions and the discussion. That was very fruitful, I thought. And hopefully it will lead to UFE interdisciplinary projects, well, BioYUFE ones. I hope so. I will end by mentioning again the upcoming webinar, the 4th one in the series, which will take place in October, and that will be on decolonizing research, another topic that we hope will draw the interest of researchers from diverse fields. And we don't have a date for it yet, but we'll figure it out and announce that soon. Okay, well, thanks again. I don't know, Michael, whether you want to add something or before we say goodbye.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, all participants and all people in the, listeners in the background there. Thanks very much for all your input. This was a really interesting discussion. I found it really quite enjoyable in a way. I've got many more questions, but we're running out of time, unfortunately. But it's been so good, so wonderful. So please join us again for the upcoming webinar if you can. I'm hoping we will announce it via various channels, and maybe we can build some sort of a database of all of you in the background one way or another, so that we can send you some information directly. So don't get annoyed with us, just delete if you're uninterested, but it may interest you. Decolonizing research is another sort of important topic for us to tackle, really. So thanks very much from my point of view as well, and I think we will probably stop the recording soon, and you can all go and do all the other things that you need to do in the background as well. All right, thanks so much. Cheers.